The rain poured heavily over the small village of Nalgar, drumming against the thatched roofs and forming puddles in the muddy streets. The dim glow of lanterns flickered through the storm, barely lighting the narrow alleys where the poor huddled under makeshift shelters. In one such hut, barely held together by scraps of wood and clay, a young potter named Arjun sat hunched over his wheel, his hands covered in wet clay. His fingers trembled from exhaustion, his stomach empty, but he kept working, shaping the spinning lump into something he could sell at the morning market. Arjun had been a potter for as long as he could remember. His father before him had molded clay into beautiful pots, and so had his grandfather. But unlike them, Arjun had never known prosperity. No matter how hard he worked, no matter how carefully he crafted each pot, life refused to show him mercy. The market traders paid him barely enough to survive, and by the time he bought food and firewood, there was nothing left. The other villagers whispered that his fate was sealed, that no matter what he did, he would always be poor. Fate. That word haunted Arjun. Was his life truly written in stone? Was he doomed to struggle forever while others feasted and thrived? The thought made his chest tighten with frustration. He wiped the sweat from his brow, staring at the half-formed pot before him. The lines weren't perfect, the shape uneven. It wasn't right. Just like his life, always on the verge of collapse, no matter how hard he tried to mold it into something better. A sudden gust of wind blew through the cracks in his hut, making the lantern flicker. The dim light caught something in the corner, a small, cracked statue of the goddess Lakshmi, the bringer of fortune. Arjun had found it years ago, buried beneath a pile of broken pots outside the temple. He had kept it, hoping that maybe, just maybe, some of her luck would rub off on him. But after years of waiting, he had begun to wonder if the gods even listened to the poor. Just then, a voice broke through the rain. "Arjun, are you in there?" It was Raghav, an old man who sold spices in the market. Arjun pushed open the creaky wooden door. Raghav stood outside, soaked to the bone, holding a bundle wrapped in cloth. His eyes darted around, as if afraid of being watched. "I don't have money for spices right now," Arjun said, assuming that was why Raghav had come. "This isn't about spices," Raghav whispered, stepping inside. He unwrapped the bundle, revealing a small, ancient-looking pot, its surface covered in strange carvings. Arjun frowned. "Where did you get this?" Raghav hesitated. "From a traveler. He said it's special, that it can change a man's fate." Arjun scoffed. "A pot can't change fate." "That's what I thought," Raghav admitted. But the traveler swore it was true. He said only the desperate could unlock its power. A cold shiver ran down Arjun's spine. Desperate? Wasn't that exactly what he was? As the storm raged on outside, Arjun stared at the mysterious pot, his heart pounding. Could it really be possible? Could he finally break free from the chains of poverty? Or was this just another cruel trick of fate? Arjun's fingers hovered over the ancient pot, hesitant yet drawn in by its strange carvings. The patterns looked almost alive under the dim lantern light, twisting and curling like waves on a stormy sea. He had seen many pots in his life, made thousands with his own hands, but nothing like this. The clay felt oddly warm, as if it had been sitting under the sun despite the cold rain outside. A strange pull formed in his chest, a whisper of something unseen, something just beyond his understanding. Raghav watched him closely, his wrinkled face full of unreadable emotions. "The traveler told me," he began, voice low, "that this pot is not meant for just anyone. It finds those who need it most. He said it holds power." Arjun let out a dry laugh. "Power? What kind of power?" Raghav shifted uncomfortably. He didn't say exactly. Only that it can change the course of one's life. But he warned that it comes at a cost. A cost. Of course. There was always a cost. Arjun wanted to ignore the old man's words, to dismiss them as the ramblings of another desperate soul looking for miracles in things that could not possibly hold them. But something about the pot made it impossible to look away. He traced one of the carvings absent-mindedly, feeling a faint vibration under his fingertips. Maybe it was his imagination, or maybe it was just the exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. Whatever it was, it made his pulse quicken. "How much did you pay for it?" Arjun finally asked. Raghav sighed. "I didn't. The traveler gave it to me. Told me to pass it on to someone who might need it more than I do." He paused, then fixed Arjun with a knowing look. "And I think that's you." Arjun felt something tighten in his throat. "Why me?" "Because I've seen you struggle," Raghav said simply. "You work harder than anyone, yet you have nothing to show for it. You're a good man, Arjun, but life has been cruel to you. Maybe this is your chance to change that." Arjun clenched his jaw. He hated how much truth was in those words. He had never wanted to believe in luck or fate, had always told himself that hard work would one day pay off. But it hadn't. No matter how much effort he put in, no matter how many nights he stayed awake shaping clay until his fingers bled, he was still trapped in the same miserable cycle. He looked back at the pot, his mind warring with itself. Finally he asked, "What am I supposed to do with it?" Raghav exhaled, relieved that Arjun wasn't rejecting it outright. "I don't know. The traveler only said that the pot reveals its secrets when the time is right." Arjun frowned. "That doesn't help." Raghav gave him a half-smile. "Since when has life ever given us clear answers?" The rain had slowed by the time Raghav left, but Arjun hardly noticed. He sat at his work table, staring at the mysterious pot as if it might move on its own. A part of him wanted to throw it away, to rid himself of the nagging feeling in his chest. But another part, one much stronger, told him to hold on to it. Maybe it was foolish. Maybe he was just grasping at straws. But if there was even the slightest chance that this pot could change his life, he had to see it through. The wind outside howled, rattling the walls of his tiny hut. The lantern flickered, casting strange shadows across the room. Arjun took a deep breath, then carefully placed the pot beside the small statue of Lakshmi. He had no idea what would happen next. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. Hope. The night dragged on, but sleep never came. Arjun lay on his thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, his mind tangled in endless thoughts. The pot sat on his work table, silent and unchanging, yet it felt as though it was watching him, waiting for something. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw its strange carvings, the way they seemed to shift in the flickering lantern light. His heart felt restless, caught between curiosity and fear. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the gaps in his hut, Arjun had made up his mind. If the pot truly held any power, he needed to know. And if it was nothing more than an old, meaningless relic, then at least he would no longer waste his thoughts on it. The village was already waking when Arjun stepped outside. The streets were damp from last night's rain, the scent of wet earth thick in the air. A few merchants were setting up their stalls in the marketplace, arranging fresh fruits, grains, and fabrics. The sight made Arjun's stomach clench. He had nothing left to buy food with. His pots from last evening sat stacked in the corner, waiting to be taken to the market. He should have been focused on selling them, earning whatever little money he could. But his eyes kept drifting back inside, to where the mysterious pot rested. He wasn't sure what he expected when he finally picked it up, but the moment his fingers brushed against its surface, a strange warmth spread through his palm. It wasn't burning, it was alive. His breath hitched, and his grip tightened. Something about the pot had changed. The carvings were deeper, the lines sharper, as if they had been freshly etched overnight. His heart pounded. Was it just his imagination? Had he simply not noticed before? He swallowed hard and did the only thing he could think of. He took the pot to the temple. The temple stood at the highest point of the village, overlooking the narrow streets and rooftops below. It wasn't grand like the ones in the cities, but it was sacred. The air smelled of incense and oil lamps, a calming contrast to the storm of thoughts in Arjun's head. Inside, the priest, an elderly man with a kind face, was arranging offerings before the idol of Lakshmi. He glanced up when Arjun entered, eyes flickering to the pot in his hands. Arjun hesitated before speaking. "Panditji, I need to know. Have you seen a pot like this before?" The priest stepped closer, his expression turning serious as he studied the carvings. His fingers traced the patterns with the same curiosity Arjun had felt. A deep frown formed between his brows. "This is unusual," the priest murmured. "Where did you find it?" "A traveler gave it to Raghav. He said it has power." The priest's lips pressed into a thin line. "Power is a dangerous thing, Arjun, especially when one does not know its source." A chill ran down Arjun's spine. "So, you believe it?" The priest didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned and disappeared into a small chamber at the back of the temple. When he returned, he held an old, dusty manuscript, its pages yellowed with time. He flipped through it with careful hands, stopping at a page that bore drawings eerily similar to the carvings on the pot. Arjun's breath caught in his throat. "This symbol," the priest pointed, "represents destiny. It is said that long ago, there were artifacts created by those who understood the flow of fate. Some could bring fortune, others ruin. But all of them required something in return." A heavy silence settled between them. Arjun's grip tightened on the pot. "What does it require?" The priest looked at him with a quiet intensity. "That depends on the one who holds it." The words sent a shiver through Arjun's bones. As he left the temple, the weight of the pot felt different in his hands. He had come looking for answers, but all he had found was more uncertainty. If the pot truly had the power to change fate, then what would it ask of him in return? And was he willing to pay the price? Arjun walked back to his hut, his mind a storm of thoughts. The priest's words echoed in his ears. Power requires something in return. He had spent his whole life being powerless, watching others rise while he remained stuck in the same miserable struggle. But now, something had changed. That night, he placed the pot in front of him and stared at it for what felt like hours. The carvings almost seemed to pulse under the dim light, whispering secrets he couldn't quite hear. His hands trembled as he reached out, fingertips grazing the surface. A sudden gust of wind blew through the cracks of his hut, making the flame of his lantern dance wildly. The air turned thick, heavy, as if the very room was holding its breath. Then, a voice, low, distant, and unfamiliar, murmured in the silence. "What do you seek?" Arjun's breath hitched. He spun around, eyes darting to every corner of the room. No one was there. His heart pounded against his ribs, but his hands remained frozen on the pot. "What do you seek?" The voice was inside his head now, coiling around his thoughts like smoke. It wasn't harsh or menacing, but it carried a weight, a presence that sent a chill through his veins. His throat was dry, but he forced himself to whisper, I want to change my fate." The air thickened even more, the weight of his own words pressing down on him. The voice did not laugh or mock him. It simply answered, "Then offer something in return." Arjun's fingers curled into fists. "What do you want?" A moment of silence. Then, the flame of his lantern flickered, casting shadows that twisted unnaturally against the walls. "A sacrifice." A cold sweat broke across Arjun's forehead. He had expected this, had known deep down that nothing came without a price. But he had no riches to give, no gold, no land. What could he possibly offer? The voice was patient. "What you cherish most." His breath caught. What did he have that was worth anything? He had no family left, no possessions beyond his clay and wheel. And then, his eyes landed on his hands. His hands, the very things that had shaped his life, that had molded thousands of pots, that had given him his craft. "No," he whispered. He took a step back, shaking his head. No, that's not. The pot remained still, yet the voice slithered back into his thoughts. To reshape fate, one must break the hands that molded the past. Panic surged through Arjun's chest. His hands were his only means of survival. If he lost them, he would have nothing. He would be nothing. But then, another thought crept in. Hadn't his hands already failed him? Hadn't they worked tirelessly for years, only to leave him poor and broken? If they had never been enough before, then what was he really losing? His pulse pounded in his ears. His whole life, he had fought against fate, against the idea that he was destined to suffer. But what if fate had been waiting for him to make a choice? His breath came in short, shallow bursts. His hands trembled as he lifted them, staring at the fingers that had shaped his existence. Was this the cost of a new destiny? The lantern flickered once more. The voice was silent now, waiting. And Arjun knew, whatever he decided in this moment, there was no turning back. Arjun's breath was uneven, his heart a war drum in his chest. His hands, his only means of survival, trembled as he held them before him. The pot sat silently, waiting for his choice, its carvings casting eerie shadows on the walls. He could feel the weight of fate pressing down on him, forcing him toward an impossible decision. If he gave up his hands, what would he become? Would fate finally favor him, or would he be left with nothing but regret? A sharp knock on his door shattered the heavy silence. Arjun jolted, his pulse spiking. He hadn't expected anyone at this hour. For a moment he hesitated, glancing between the pot and the door. The knock came again, more urgent this time. Swallowing hard, he forced himself to move, pushing aside his hesitation as he unlatched the door. Standing outside in the cold night was Raghav, his face drawn with worry. His eyes flicked to Arjun's pale face before shifting to the pot still sitting on the table behind him. His expression darkened. You used it, didn't you? Raghav's voice was tight, almost accusing. Arjun stiffened. What are you talking about? Raghav didn't step inside. Instead, he stayed at the threshold, as if afraid to cross over. The traveler warned me, he muttered. He said the pot, it doesn't just change fate. It twists it. A cold chill ran down Arjun's spine. Twists it. Raghav's throat bobbed as he swallowed. Whatever it gives, it takes something else in return. And sometimes, the price isn't what you expect. Arjun's mind raced. He had been so focused on his hands, on whether or not he could part with them, that he hadn't considered what else could be taken. What if the pot had already chosen a sacrifice? Dread slithered through his veins. He turned sharply toward the pot, his breathing shallow. The carvings seemed deeper now, darker, almost as if the clay itself had absorbed the very essence of his hesitation. A strange noise echoed through the room, soft at first but growing louder, a whispering like dozens of voices speaking at once. Arjun's skin prickled as the air thickened again, the same weight he had felt before pressing against his chest. And then the door behind him slammed shut. Raghav cursed, stepping back, his face twisted with fear. Arjun, listen to me. We need to get rid of it. Arjun shook his head, his fingers twitching at his sides. I can't, he whispered. Not yet. The whispering grew, the shadows stretching unnaturally along the walls. Arjun's gaze snapped to the pot. The air around it shimmered like heat rising from the earth, and then, without warning, the pot cracked. A jagged fracture split through one of the carvings, and for a moment, the entire room seemed to vibrate. A sharp, invisible force sent Arjun stumbling backward, a piercing sound ringing in his ears. The lantern flickered violently, nearly going out. And then, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Arjun's breathing was ragged as he slowly pushed himself upright, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst. His eyes darted to the pot, expecting it to have shattered completely. But it hadn't. Instead, something had changed. The crack that had formed on its surface had revealed something beneath the clay, something glinting faintly in the dim light. It wasn't just a pot. It was a shell, covering something hidden within. Arjun's fingers twitched. His fear warred with curiosity, but deep down he already knew this was no ordinary artifact. And whatever lay inside, whatever had been sealed away, was never meant to be found. Raghav took a slow step back. "Arjun," he said carefully, "don't touch it." But it was too late. The choice had already been made. Arjun's fingers hovered over the crack in the pot, his breath shallow. The faint glint of something hidden beneath the clay sent a chill down his spine. Every instinct told him to stop, to step away, to leave whatever was buried inside untouched. But something stronger, something deep, almost primal, pushed him forward. His entire life had been a series of failures, of watching fate slip through his fingers like sand. If this was his one chance to change everything, he couldn't walk away now. Ignoring Raghav's whispered warnings, Arjun reached out and pressed his fingertips against the crack. The moment his skin made contact, a sharp heat surged through his palm, crawling up his arm like fire. His breath caught, but he didn't pull away. The pot trembled, as if alive, and then, with a brittle snap, the clay shattered. A blinding golden light burst from within, swallowing the room in its glow. Arjun stumbled back, shielding his eyes, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. The air crackled, thick with an unseen force, and for a moment, time itself seemed to pause. Then, as the light faded, Arjun saw what lay at the heart of the pot. A single golden coin. It was small, unremarkable in shape, yet it radiated an unnatural warmth. Symbols, ancient and unfamiliar, were etched into its surface, shifting like liquid metal. Arjun's pulse quickened. A coin. Was this the key to changing fate? Could something so simple hold the power he had been desperate for? Raghav's voice was barely above a whisper. "Arjun, put it down." But Arjun couldn't. The moment his fingers brushed against the coin, a strange sensation rippled through him. The weight of his body felt different, as if the very fabric of reality was bending around him. A rush of memories, his failures, his struggles, his endless nights of hunger, flashed through his mind. And then, just as suddenly, they were gone. A new memory took their place. Arjun blinked in shock. He was no longer in his small, crumbling hut. He was standing in a grand marketplace, dressed in silk, his hands weighed down with gold rings. Merchants bowed as he passed, his name spoken with reverence. He owned the largest pottery business in the region, his wealth stretching beyond imagination. It was everything he had ever wanted. The world blurred again. In the next instant, he stood in a lavish home, servants rushing to his side, his mother, alive and well, smiling at him with pride. His stomach twisted. Had the coin rewritten his life? Had he truly escaped his suffering? But then, something shifted. A figure stepped into view, one that made Arjun's blood run cold. It was him. Or rather, the version of him that had lived the old life. The poor potter, the man with calloused hands, the one who had spent his days shaping clay and struggling to survive. He stood at the edge of the vision, silent, eyes hollow with something unreadable. And then, with a sickening realization, Arjun understood. The coin hadn't erased his past. It had simply replaced him. The other Arjun, the one he had been, stared at him, his form flickering like a dying flame. Slowly, his lips moved, but no sound came out. Yet Arjun knew what he was saying. This was my life. A wave of nausea crashed over him. The pot hadn't been a gift. It had been a prison. It didn't grant new fates, it stole them, swapping lives like a cruel game. And now, another version of himself was lost, erased, nothing more than a fading shadow. The golden coin burned in his palm. Panic surged through him. He had to fix this. He had to undo it. But even as the thought formed, the world around him began to shift again. His vision darkened, his body growing weightless. The last thing he saw before everything went black was the other Arjun, reaching for him, eyes filled with something he could only describe as warning. Then, silence. When Arjun's eyes opened again, he was back in his hut. The pot was gone. The coin lay in the dirt beside him, its glow dimmed. Raghav stood frozen, his face pale. He had seen everything. Arjun's chest heaved. His hands, his real hands, were still his own. He had returned. But the presence of the coin, the emptiness where the other Arjun had stood, told him the truth. Not everyone had. His stomach twisted. Had he just condemned another version of himself to a life he had desperately tried to escape? Was fate something that could ever be rewritten without consequence? Raghav swallowed hard. What do we do now? Arjun didn't answer. Slowly, carefully, he picked up the coin. It no longer burned. It was nothing more than cold, lifeless metal in his hands. But he knew better. He had felt its power, witnessed its price. Without a word, he stepped outside. The first light of dawn stretched across the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson. Arjun took a slow, deep breath, then clenched his fist around the coin. And with all the strength he had, he hurled it into the river. The water swallowed it whole. No ripple, no trace. Just stillness. But as Arjun stood there, staring at the place where it had disappeared, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere, in another life, another version of him was watching. And that version knew. Fate was never something to be taken. It was something to be lived. Arjun stood by the riverbank long after the coin had vanished beneath the water's surface. His breath was slow, measured, as if trying to convince himself that what had just happened was real. The sun had fully risen now, casting golden light over the quiet village, but the weight in his chest remained heavy. The world looked the same, but he was not the same man who had woken up in his small hut the night before. Raghav stood a few steps behind, watching him carefully. He hadn't spoken since Arjun threw the coin into the river, but his silence said more than words could. He was afraid of what the pot had been, afraid of what it had nearly done to Arjun. But most of all, afraid of the knowledge they now carried. "Do you think it's really gone?" Raghav finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Arjun turned to him, his face unreadable. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I can't let it control me anymore." Raghav nodded slowly. "And the other you?" The question sent a shiver down Arjun's spine. He had seen the other version of himself, the one whose life had been erased to make room for the new fate. Was he still out there somewhere, lost between worlds, or had he disappeared the moment Arjun had rejected the coin's power? The thought made his stomach twist. "Maybe he's free now," Arjun said, though he wasn't sure if he was trying to convince Raghav or himself. "Maybe that was the real price. Not my hands, not my past, but the truth, that fate isn't something we can bargain with." Raghav let out a slow breath and glanced toward the river. "Then it's over," he said. "Right?" Arjun didn't answer right away. His fingers curled into fists as he stared at the water, at the place where the coin had disappeared. It had been a piece of something much older, much darker than he had ever imagined. He had been desperate enough to believe in its promises, blind to the cost that came with them. And yet, even now, he couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't been the first to hold it. Or the last. A part of him wanted to believe the river would keep it buried forever. But deep down, he knew better. Something like that never truly disappeared. One day, someone else would find it. Someone just as desperate, just as lost as he had been. And when that day came, would they make the same choice? Or would they fall into the same trap? He turned to Raghav, forcing himself to push away the unease creeping into his thoughts. "We don't speak of this again," he said firmly. "Not to anyone." Raghav hesitated, but then nodded. "Agreed." They walked back toward the village in silence. The early morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and burning firewood. Life was beginning as usual. Merchants setting up their stalls, children running through the narrow streets, potters shaping clay with steady hands. Everything looked unchanged. But Arjun felt the difference inside him. When they reached his hut, Raghav stopped at the door. "What will you do now?" Arjun glanced at his hands, at the fingers that had shaped his entire life. For the first time, he saw them not as a curse but as a gift. He had spent years resenting his fate, believing that suffering was his only path. But maybe fate had never been his enemy. Maybe it had been waiting for him to accept it on his own terms. "I'll keep making pots," he said simply. "Not because I have no choice, but because I do." Raghav studied him for a moment, then gave a small, knowing smile. "That sounds like a good fate to me." As Raghav walked away, Arjun stepped inside his hut, inhaling the familiar scent of damp clay. His wheel sat in the corner, untouched since the night before. Slowly, he moved toward it, running his fingers over its surface. It was strange, how something so simple could hold the power to shape a life. He sat down, pressing his foot against the pedal, and the wheel began to spin. The clay was cool beneath his touch, molding and shifting with each careful movement of his hands. For the first time in a long time, he didn't feel trapped by his craft. He felt free. Outside, the village carried on, unaware of the choice that had just been made, of the fate that had nearly been rewritten. Arjun didn't know what the future held. But he did know one thing. Fate was not something to fight. It was something to shape, one moment, one choice at a time. And this time, it was his to create.